It all started with 4 words: ethical non-monogamy. It was the perfect progressive camouflage for a very old, very common crime. I agreed to his rules because I was terrified of being abandoned. That was my first mistake. His was in underestimating just how methodical my rage could be. The first thing you notice about our house is the silence. It's an architectural silence, a deliberate absence of sound. We lived in a $3 million echo chamber of polished concrete, glass, and shadow, cantilevered over the Austin Hills. As an architect, I had designed it myself. A monument to order, a place where every line was clean and every surface was hard. For the first 10 years, that silence felt like peace. For the last 10, it just felt empty. That night, the silence was heavy, broken only by the clink of Mark's whiskey glass on the marble countertop and the distant hum of the city lights below. I was at the 10-foot dining table, my tablet glowing, reviewing the structural plans for a new university library. Order, logic, load-bearing walls. Mark, as usual, was leaning against the kitchen island, staring at his phone, tap, 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 his thumb scrolling endlessly. He was 50, but he wore his age like a costume he was desperate to shed. The slim-fit jeans, the artfully distressed t-shirt, the new aggressive scent of sandalwood and bergamot. He was a marketing consultant, and his greatest product had always been himself. Lately, I felt like he was preparing for a relaunch. "The pad thai is getting cold," I said, not looking up from a flawed load calculation. Oh, yeah, he didn't move. The blue light of his phone cast hollows under his eyes. "Lila," he said, his voice suddenly too loud in the quiet room. "We need to talk." I looked up. The knot in my stomach, the one that had been a dull ache for a year, tightened. "Okay." He set his phone face down on the counter, a gesture of performative seriousness. He topped off his whiskey and walked over, sitting not across from me, but at the head of the table, a chairman calling a meeting. "I've been doing a lot of reading," he started. This was never a good sign. Mark's reading was a curated feed of articles that confirmed what he already wanted. About us. About where we are. He gestured vaguely at the perfect, sterile room. "We're stuck, Lee. You know we are. It's stagnant." I said nothing. Stagnant was his word. My word was stable. "We're 48 and 50, he continued, leaning forward, earnest. "This is it, the third act. And I don't want to spend it like this, just waiting. Waiting for what? For something. For life." He ran a hand through his carefully thinning hair. "I love you. You know that. You're my rock." I hated being called his rock. A rock is something you stand on to get a better view. It's something you leave behind when you're done. "Mark, what did you read?" He took a breath. This was the pitch. I'd seen him practice this tone for clients. Charismatic, revolutionary, a little bit dangerous. Ethical non-monogamy. The words just hung there, obscene in our quiet, orderly home. The hum of the wine fridge suddenly seemed deafening. I felt a flush of heat, a prickle of nausea. It was a physical rejection before my brain could even form a word. "You're joking," I said. "No. Hear me out. It's not what you think. It's not about sleazy affairs." He was talking faster now, the salesman in full flow. "It's about honesty. Total radical honesty. It's about revitalizing us. We'd be doing it together." "Together?" My voice was flat. "By sleeping with other people?" "By being open to other people," he corrected. "It's progressive, Lila. We're not our parents. We can redefine what this marriage means. We can have our freedom and our security. We can have this." He slapped the beautiful cold table. "And we can have exploration, new energy. We'd bring that energy back here, to each other." He was pitching me my own betrayal as a feature upgrade. I stared at him, my mind racing. I saw the rejection for what it was. I wasn't enough. The house wasn't enough. 20 years wasn't enough. He wanted more, and he was packaging it as a philosophical breakthrough. My first instinct, the architect's instinct, was to find the flaw in the design. You've met someone. It wasn't a question. No. He looked genuinely offended, his eyes wide. Absolutely not. Lee, this is about the concept. It's about us. If I'd met someone, I'd tell you. That's the whole point. Total honesty. He seemed so sincere. And God help me, I was a fixer. My entire life was dedicated to the principle that any problem could be solved with the right set of rules. A failing structure, a flawed marriage. I saw the cracks forming, and my immediate impulse was to patch them, not to call the demolition crew. What if he was right? What if I was the one who was old-fashioned? What if I said no, and that refusal was the thing that finally made him leave? The word abandoned flashed in my head, cold and sharp. I don't know, Mark. Just think about it, he said, his voice softening, sensing a crack. He moved from his chair and knelt beside me, taking my hand. His was so warm. Mine was ice. It would be for us. To save us, we'd set rules. You're the best at rules. He was right about that. My mind, clinging to any piece of solid ground, latched onto the word. Rules, I repeated. Exactly. Whatever you want. I pulled my hand away and stood up, walking to the wall of glass that overlooked the city. The lights blurred. I was designing the bylaws for my own humiliation. Rule number 1, I said, my voice shaking but firm. No one we know. No one from our professional circles. No friends, no colleagues. Of course, absolutely, strangers only. Rule number 2, no emotional entanglements. This is a physical release. It's not about love. You said that. You don't love them. Never. You're the one I love. I turned to face him. Rule number 3, our life stays our life. Tuesday and Friday nights are ours. Date nights, sacred. No matter what. Sacred, he agreed, nodding. He stood up, his face flooded with a relief that was so profound, so sudden, that it felt like another betrayal. He'd been terrified I'd say no. He'd had this pitch ready for weeks. Okay, I said, the word tasting like ash. Okay, Mark, we can try. He closed the distance between us and hugged me, burying his face in my hair. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick. Thank you, Lee. This is going to save us. You'll see, I didn't hug him back. I just stood there, my hands at my sides, a rigid column in the center of the beautiful, empty room I had built. I was his rock. He pulled away, his eyes bright. I'm going to open that '98 cab we were saving. This is a celebration. He went to the wine fridge, his steplight for the first time in months. I stayed by the window, staring at my reflection in the dark glass. I saw a 48-year-old woman, successful, pragmatic, and so terrified of being alone that she had just agreed to dismantle her own life. The architect had just signed off on a plan she knew was structurally unsound. And I had a sickening feeling that the first wall was already beginning to crumble. The app was called Ethos. Mark had found it, of course. It was for discerning, open-minded professionals. The profiles were all muted tones and vague job titles. It felt less like a dating app and more like a catalog for modular furniture. My one and only attempt was a man named David, a data analyst, divorced. His picture showed him hiking, smiling a tight, joyless smile. We met at a hotel bar downtown, one of those aggressively neutral spaces designed for transactions. The air smelled of stale beer and sharp industrial lemon polish. In the corner, a man with a guitar was murdering a James Taylor song. Lila, David said, standing up. He was shorter than his photos. You look exactly like your picture. So do you, I said. It felt like an accusation. We settled into a booth with cracked, maroon-colored vinyl that felt cold against my legs. We ordered drinks. He had a craft beer. I had a vodka soda. I just wanted something clean and antiseptic. So, architecture, he said, trying. That's fascinating. I'm just in data. Data is fascinating, I said. It's all patterns. Right, patterns. He nodded, taking a too large gulp of his beer. You and your husband, you've been open for a while? The word open made me picture a wound. Not long, I said, stirring my drink. The ice cubes chimed against the glass. It's a new arrangement. Cool, cool. He looked around the bar, anywhere but at me. My ex-wife would never have, she was very traditional. I realized then what this was. This wasn't exploration. This was a job interview for which I was fundamentally unqualified. He was telling me his problem, and I was supposed to be the solution. I felt an overwhelming urge to pull out my tablet and show him a structural diagram. See? This is how things stand up. This is just chaos. We talked about Austin's traffic. We talked about a new restaurant he tried. I found myself analyzing the bar's poor lighting design, the way the recessed fixtures cast ugly, deep shadows on everyone's faces. I was dissociating, methodically. After 45 minutes of this polite, sterile chatter, he put his hand on my arm. His skin was damp and cool. "My room is just upstairs," he said, his voice dropping. I looked at his hand. I saw the neatly trimmed nails, the sprinkle of fine dark hair. I felt nothing. No, that wasn't true. I felt a profound, bottomless hollowness. This was the new energy I was supposed to bring home? This clammy-handed stranger? This felt like a betrayal of myself. "I'm sorry," I said, pulling my arm away. I was surprised by how steady my voice was. "I've made a mistake. This isn't for me." I didn't wait for his reaction. I slid out of the booth, dropped a 20 on the table for my drink, and walked out. The cool night air hit my face, and I inhaled deeply, the smell of exhaust fumes and damp pavement 1,000 times better than the manufactured neutrality of that bar. I drove home, my hands gripping the wheel. I went straight to the shower. I turned the water on, scalding hot, and scrubbed my skin with a loofah until it was red, washing away the smell of the bar, the feel of his hand. I felt hollowed out, a shell. But Mark was a different story. The experiment, for him, was a stunning success. It was like he'd mainlined vitality. He was energized, vibrant. He'd been sullen and distant for a year, and suddenly, the man I married was back. He started waking up early. He was jogging again. "Morning, Lee," he'd say, kissing my forehead as I squinted at my coffee machine. He'd smell of sweat, sandalwood, and a bright, sharp, new energy. "Brought you a croissant from that new place." He hadn't brought me anything in 5 years. He was affectionate. He'd grab my waist as I reviewed blueprints at the island. He'd tell me I looked amazing in the black sheath dress I always wore. He started talking again about his clients, about ideas, about the future. "I had dinner with a fascinating woman last night," he told me one morning, all casual honesty. "A venture capitalist. Totally brilliant, just sharp, It's amazing the energy you can get from a new mind." I nodded, sipping my coffee. "That's great, Mark," and I meant it. In a sick, pragmatic way, I meant it. This was the trade-off. This was the bargain I had made. I had agreed to this ethical arrangement to save my marriage, and from my perspective, it was working. He was happy. He was engaged. He was here. He was no longer the restless, phone-obsessed ghost haunting our perfect house. The silence was filled with his new, bright chatter. I didn't have to participate. I didn't have to go back to the hotel bars and the clammy-handed Davids. I just had to allow. I just had to be the rock. I was an architect. I could accommodate a new, strange addition as long as the foundation remained intact. I mistook his vibrancy for our revitalization. We had our sacred Tuesday date night coming up. Ours, no one else's. We were going to Perla's, our old place. Oysters and Sancerre. The reservation had been on the calendar for a month. I found myself, for the first time in ages, actually looking forward to it. It felt like a reward for being so progressive. A return to us. Tuesday night, I left the firm early. I put on a dark blue silk blouse and the diamond earrings he'd given me for our 40th birthdays. I was reapplying my lipstick, the expensive, quiet red I loved, when my phone buzzed on the bathroom's quartz counter. It was Mark. A text, not a call. "So sorry, baby. Work emergency. Massive client dinner just popped up. Have to take this one. Going to be late. Rain check on Perla's? You're the best. Love you." I stared at the message. The bright white light of the screen. I read it twice. Work emergency. A cold, sharp feeling pierced the hollow space inside me. It was disappointment, but it was edged with something else, something suspicious. He'd never canceled a sacred night before. This was the first tiny crack in the new rules. The rules he'd agreed to. I looked at my reflection in the vast mirror. My lipstick was perfect, my earrings glittered, and I was all dressed up, completely alone in my silent, perfect house. The hollowness I'd felt in that bar came rushing back, deeper this time. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the call button. I wanted to hear his voice. I wanted to hear him lie, but I didn't. I, the fixer, the pragmatist, typed back a single accommodating word. Okay, next time. I set the phone down. I took off the earrings, the clink as they hit the counter echoing in the silence. I stood in the silence of the bathroom for a long time. The text message glowed on the counter, a little rectangle of light in the dim room. You're the best. Love you. The words were so easy for him. Automatic. A punctuation mark at the end of a lie. Slowly, methodically, I began to reverse the process of getting ready. I unhooked the diamond earrings. The clink they made on the quartz counter was the loudest sound in the house. I took a cotton pad and wiped away the red lipstick, leaving a faint, greasy smear. I unzipped the blue silk blouse and let it fall. I was just an architect again, in my camisole and slacks. I was just the rock. The disappointment I'd felt was cooling, hardening into something else. Something colder and more precise. Suspicion. My mind, trained to find stress fractures and design flaws, seized on the lie. Work emergency. It was too convenient, too easy. It was the oldest excuse in the book, gift-wrapped in our new, progressive language. Our agreement was built on one single load-bearing wall, total, radical honesty. And I had a sudden, sinking feeling he had just taken a sledgehammer to it. I didn't cry. I didn't throw anything. I walked down the floating staircase, my bare feet cold on the polished concrete, and went into my home office. This was my room, my sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling shelves of technical manuals, rolled blueprints, and structural models. The air smelled of paper and clean, dry ozone from the plotter. I sat in my Eames chair, the leather hissing as I settled in. I opened my laptop. I told myself I was just checking, just verifying. An architect trusts the blueprints, but she always double-checks the measurements on site. I opened our joint bank account, the platinum card, the one he used for business expenses, the one I automatically paid off every month from our main account. I clicked on pending transactions. My heart wasn't hammering. It was slow, thudding, a dull, heavy beat against my ribs. I scrolled. Shell, 68.40. Starbucks, 7.12. Dry cleaning, $112. And then I saw it. Time stamped 7:45 p.m., 20 minutes ago. 30 minutes after he'd sent me the text. The charge was from The Velvet Quill. I'd never heard of it. I Googled it. It wasn't a client steakhouse. It wasn't a dinner location at all. It was a cocktail lounge, dark and expensive, in the new Hotel San Cristobal, halfway across the city, far from his office, far from any of his known clients. The website showed pictures of people who looked half his age, lounging on plush sofas, bathed in red, moody light. The charge was for $78 to $50. My mind started calculating. A massive work emergency, a client dinner, $78 to $50. That isn't a dinner. That's 2 cocktails, maybe 3. That's 1 appetizer shared. It was a charge for an assignation. It was the receipt for an intimate, 2-person moment. He had lied. He had broken our sacred rule, date night, and then he had lied about why. The open relationship, I realized, was the perfect camouflage. He had created a system where he could lie about a work dinner, or he could tell the truth about a date with a stranger from ethos. And in either scenario, I was required to be the cool, understanding, progressive wife. He had built himself an escape hatch with no alarms. I felt a sudden glacial coldness. It wasn't the hot, messy rage of a wife betrayed. It was the cold, precise anger of an architect who just found a fatal flaw in the foundation, a flaw that she suspected the contractor had put there on purpose. My first impulse was to call him. "Where are you, Mark?" But what would he say? He'd lie again. He'd say the client moved the meeting. He'd say he grabbed a quick drink first. He'd have an answer. He was a salesman. He always had an answer. Confrontation would only teach him to be a better liar. No, I was a pragmatist. I was a fixer. You don't demolish a building at the first sign of a crack. You survey, you run tests, you find out exactly how deep the rot goes. I took a screenshot of the charge from the velvet quill. I created a new encrypted folder on my private server. I named the folder Structural. I saved the image. This was a new project. I closed the laptop and sat there in the dark. The city lights below looked like scattered, indifferent jewels. I was no longer a participant in my marriage. I was an observer. I must have sat there for hours. The house was utterly silent. Just before midnight, I heard the crunch of his tires on the gravel driveway, the heavy sound of the front door opening and closing, the clatter of his keys in the ceramic bowl on the console. "Lila?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous main room. It sounded light, cheerful. I stayed perfectly still. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, slow, a little unsteady. He'd had more than one of those 70-80-50 cocktails. His shadow appeared in my office doorway, blocking the hall light. "Hey, you fell asleep in here?" I turned. He was leaning against the door jamb, smiling that new, energized smile. He looked good, I had to admit. His face was flushed, his eyes bright. "Sorry about tonight," he said, running a hand through his hair. "The client was a lot. You wouldn't believe." I looked at him, my face a perfect, neutral mask. I could smell the sandalwood of his cologne, but underneath it, there was something else. A faint, sweet floral scent, not my perfume. "It's fine, Mark," I said, my voice as calm and steady as the concrete floor. "I was just catching up on some work." "Right." He yawned, a big theatrical stretch. "Well, I'm beat. Coming to bed?" "In a minute," I said, turning back to my dark screen. "I just need to finish this drawing." He nodded, blew me a kiss that landed in the air between us, and disappeared down the hall. I waited until I heard our bedroom door click shut. I opened the structural folder. One file. It looked lonely. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it wouldn't be lonely for long. I lived a double life for the next 3 weeks. By day, I was the perfect, understanding, progressive wife. I was Lila, the rock. I'd listen as Mark recounted his fascinating evenings with brilliant strangers from Ethos. I'd nod. I'd ask supportive, neutral questions, and I'd dutifully add our sacred date nights to the calendar, which he now, guiltily, never missed. By night, I was an architect of a different sort. I sat in my office, the door closed, the only light, the blue-white glow of my monitors, and I analyzed the structural integrity of my marriage. The structural folder grew, another client dinner at an expensive bar. A charge for a boutique hotel, the Marlowe, explained away as, "A new client I'm trying to land, had to put his room on my card." A charge for flowers, not for me, from a high-end downtown florist. I cross-referenced everything. His calendar, our bank statements, the texts he'd send. "Running late, baby. Early start, don't wait up." I was building a blueprint of his lies. It was methodical. It was precise. And it was, in its own sterile way, comforting. I was gathering data. I was identifying a pattern. The emotions, the hot, messy flush of betrayal, the hollow ache of loneliness. I filed them away. This was a job. The real break in the case didn't come from a spreadsheet. It came from his own sloppy arrogance. It was a Saturday morning in late November. The air was crisp, and the sun was weak, casting long, watery shadows across our polished concrete floors. Mark, in his new revitalized state, was on a 10-mile run. "You sure you don't want to come?" he'd asked, stretching his hamstrings, vibrant in his expensive new running gear. "I'm reviewing a HVAC proposal," I said, already at the kitchen island with my coffee and my tablet. "You go." He kissed my hair, his lips cool, his skin smelling of sandalwood, and bounced out the door, his playlist already thumping in his earbuds. I heard the crunch of his shoes on the gravel drive. And then the house returned to its normal state, silence. I worked for an hour. My coffee went cold. I got up to refill my mug, walking past his side of the island. He had left his laptop. It was sitting right there, open. The screen was dark, asleep. This was new. Before, he was chained to his devices. Now, he was so confident in our arrangement, so secure in my passive, progressive acceptance, that he'd become careless. He had nothing to hide, right? We had total, radical honesty. My hand twitched. I had respected his privacy. My investigation had been limited to shared data, the bank accounts, the calendars he shared with me. This felt different. This was his private machine. I told myself I was just going to close it. I stood over it, my coffee mug in my hands. I reached out. My finger brushed the trackpad. The screen lit up. He hadn't even locked it. His desktop was cluttered. Proposals, marketing decks, budgets. But his personal iMessage account was open, minimized in the dock. I stared at it. Don't. This isn't the plan. But my eyes drifted to the icon next to it. The Photos app. It was syncing. A small blue progress bar was filling. Updating. I clicked it. The library opened. It was mostly innocuous. Sunsets. Photos of his new running shoes. Bad pictures of food from Ethos dates, likely sent to a friend. And then I saw the People album. The little tagged circles. My face, his brother's face, and her face. She had her own circle. It was labeled Chloe. The main photo was a candid shot of her laughing, head thrown back, a glass of wine in her hand. She was young, maybe 30. She was beautiful, but not in a soft way. She was sharp, ambitious, all angles and perfect, expensive-looking teeth. My hand was shaking. I set the coffee mug down. The clink on the marble was sharp. I clicked on her album. There were dozens of photos. Here was Chloe, clinking a champagne glass with him at what looked like an office party. Here was Chloe in his passenger seat, sunglasses on, the wind in her hair. Here was Chloe at brunch, eating an oyster off his fork, his hand on her arm. Here was Chloe, wearing his marketing conference lanyard, posing by a trade show banner. A cold, sick feeling washed over me. No one from our professional circles. That was rule number 1, my first most important rule. Who are you, Chloe? I slid onto his stool. My fingers flew across the trackpad. I opened his browser. I went to his firm's website, the marketing consultancy he was a partner in. I clicked Our Team. I scrolled past Mark's visionary bio, past the CFO, past the creative directors, and there she was, Chloe Stevens. 31, Vice President, Brand Strategy. The bio was breathless. A Forbes 30 Under 30 winner, a disruptor. She'd been hired 8 months ago. 31, his own firm. The betrayal was so brazen, so total, that I couldn't breathe. He'd broken the most important rule. He was dating a subordinate, a VP in his own company, a woman 17 years younger than me. I gripped the edge of the cold marble island. Breathe, Lila, just breathe. This was bad. This was a catastrophic failure of the agreement. But then, the final piece clicked into place. The keystone that made the entire rotten structure make sense. 8 months. She'd been hired 8 months ago. I went back to the Photos app. I scrolled to the very first picture of her. It wasn't the office party. It was a selfie. Just the two of them, huddled close, smiling. He looked giddy. He looked the way he hadn't looked. At me in a decade. I checked the timestamp on the photo. May 14th. I felt the blood drain from my face. May 14th. He had proposed the open relationship to me in September. He had been seeing her for 6 months, before he ever sat me down at the dining table, before he ever used the words ethical non-monogamy or progressive. It was never an experiment. It was never about us. It wasn't an exploration to save our marriage. It was an exit strategy. He hadn't just broken the rules. He had built the rules to cover his tracks. He'd used my logic, my pragmatism, my fear of being old-fashioned as a tool. He'd made me the architect of my own cuckolding. He had made me agree to the affair he was already having. The hollowness I'd felt, the sadness, the disappointment, it all evaporated in an instant. It was replaced by something else. It was a cold, pure, glacial rage. It was so solid, so heavy, it felt like I'd swallowed a block of ice. My pain didn't just hurt. It calcified. It turned from a messy, liquid grief into something hard and sharp. A weapon. I heard a sound. The crunch of gravel outside. He was back. I didn't panic. My hands were perfectly steady. I selected the dozen most incriminating photos. The ones with the timestamps. The selfie from May. The brunch shot. The one of her in his car. I clicked share. I airdropped them to my phone. They transferred in a swoosh. I deleted the airdrop notification from his laptop. I went back to the Photos app and closed it. I cleared his browser history. I right-clicked on the trash can and selected empty trash. I slid off the stool and picked up my cold coffee mug just as the front door opened. He walked in, glistening with sweat, a triumphant, exhausted grin on his face. He smelled of the cold winter air and sandalwood. 10 miles, he panted, pulling out his earbuds. Killed it. I feel amazing. I turned from the island, my phone heavy with his secrets in my pocket. I looked at him. I saw a liar, a fraud, a cheat who was so cowardly he'd had to invent a philosophical movement to cover his tracks. That's great, Mark, I said. My voice was perfectly even. You want some coffee? He smiled at me. The loving, affectionate smile of a man who thought he had everything figured out. You're the best, Lee, I smiled back. I was the rock. And he had no idea I was about to become the avalanche. I became the best wife in Austin. While the ice in my veins cooled and hardened, my exterior became warm, accommodating, even affectionate. I was a structural engineer of deceit. And I was building a facade so flawless, so supportive, that Mark would never think to look at the demolition charges I was planting at the foundations. Morning. Baby, I'd say, handing him his coffee. Just the way he liked it, black, with 1 raw sugar. I touch his arm. My hand, which I was terrified would feel like a block of ice, felt perfectly warm. You're amazing, he'd murmur, kissing my temple. He was deep in the honeymoon phase, not just with Chloe, but with his new, consequence-free life. He was sleeping with his 31-year-old VP, and his 48-year-old wife was handling it with the calm, progressive grace he'd always wanted. He had, quite literally, engineered his perfect world. I encouraged him. You seem tired, Mark, I said one evening, my voice full of practiced concern. You should take a night off. Go have fun. Go see, whoever. You deserve it. Really. He looked at me, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes, searching for the trap. I gave him a placid, understanding smile. Really, we're revitalizing, remember? It seems to be working for you. I like seeing you this happy. The suspicion vanished, replaced by a deep, profound relief. He was getting away with it. He hugged me, his sandalwood scent, which was now inextricably linked with her, filling my lungs. I didn't flinch. You are, he whispered into my hair, the most incredible woman in the world. I'm the rock, Mark, I said, patting his back. Go on, have fun. And he did. While he was out revitalizing, I was in my office, my door locked, my monitors dimmed. My performance as the perfect understanding wife was just Act 1. Act 2 was the plan. I wasn't just a betrayed wife. I was a client who had been defrauded. I didn't need a divorce lawyer. I needed a liquidator. My research was methodical. I spent 2 nights, fueled by black coffee and a cold, clear rage, vetting every high-asset divorce attorney in the state of Texas. I read court filings. I read financial settlements. I wasn't looking for a fair negotiator. I was looking for a shark. I found her on the third night. Her name was Diana Kincaid. Her firm's office was in a downtown high-rise, a spire of reflective blue glass that stabbed at the sky. Her website had no pictures of smiling families. It was just her name, a list of credentials, and a client portal login. Her reviews, hidden deep on legal forums, used words like ruthless, surgical, and terrifying. She was perfect. I used a burner email and a prepaid burner phone, bought with cash from an H-E-B grocery store, to make the appointment. I booked it under my maiden name. I took a half-day off from the firm, telling Mark I was doing an on-site inspection. I wore my most severe, expensive architect's uniform, a black-on-black pantsuit, my hair pulled back in a tight architectural bun, and my face a mask of neutral competence. Diana's office was on the 40th floor. The air was cold and smelled faintly of leather and Windex. Her assistant, a man who looked more like a bodyguard, led me to a conference room that was nothing but a slab of black marble and a wall of glass overlooking the city. Diana Kincaid was not what I expected. She was small, in her 60s, and wore a bright canary yellow suit. She looked like a bird until you saw her eyes. Her eyes were chips of obsidian. "Miss Hale," she said, using my maiden name. She didn't stand. She gestured to a chair. "You have 1 hour. Your retainer, should I accept this case, is $100,000. The clock is running. Talk." I didn't cry. I didn't tremble. I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a 256 gigabyte encrypted flash drive, and slid it across the cold, black marble. "My name is Lila Reed. My husband is Mark Reed, a partner at GSD&M Marketing. This is the structural folder." I opened my laptop and placed it next to the drive. In September, my husband proposed an open relationship, citing ethical non-monogamy. I agreed, under specific rules, no professional colleagues, and no pre-existing emotional entanglements. Diana watched me, her face utterly blank. "I've discovered he has been in a relationship for the last 8 months with a 31-year-old vice president at his firm, Chloe Stevens. The open relationship was a lie, constructed to provide cover for an affair he was already having." "That's just a standard infidelity claim, Ms. Reed," Diana said, her voice dry. "Texas is a community property state. It's messy, but it doesn't change the math. 50-50. I'm not here for 50-50, Ms. Kincaid," I said, my voice as cold as the room. "I'm not here because he cheated. I'm here because I believe he's stealing." That got her attention. She leaned forward just an inch. I opened the file on my laptop. The screenshots, the bank statements, the hotel charges disguised as client meetings, the flower deliveries, the timeline that proved the lies. "This is the initial data," I said. "This is what I found on our shared accounts. I believe it's the tip of the iceberg. He is arrogant, he is careless, and I believe he is using our joint assets to fund his new life." Diana looked at the screen for a long, silent minute. She clicked through the photos of Chloe. She read the timestamps. She studied the credit card receipts. Finally, she looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something in her obsidian eyes. It was professional appreciation. "You've done good work, Ms. Reed," she said. "You're right. Infidelity is leverage for a settlement, but fraud is a verdict." She picked up her desk phone. "Peter, clear my next hour, and get me Arthur Voss." She hung up. "Arthur Voss," she explained, "is the most ruthless forensic accountant in this city. He's a bloodhound. He finds money that doesn't want to be found. He will go through your husband's life, his business, his private accounts, his tax returns, like a swarm of termites. He will find everything." "Good," I said. "This is the point of no return," Diana warned, her voice sharp. "If Voss goes in, you can't pull him back, and you cannot, under any circumstances, let your husband know. You have to continue to be the perfect, progressive, understanding wife." "Can you do that?" "I'm an architect, Ms. Kincaid," I said. I'm very good at building things. Good. 10 minutes later, Arthur Voss walked in. He was the complete opposite of Diana. He was tall, pale, and seemed to blend into the beige walls. He wore a rumpled suit and carried a worn leather satchel. He looked like a man who hadn't seen the sun in a decade. He nodded at Diana, then at me. I explained it all again, but faster this time. The lies, the rules, Chloe, the structural folder. Voss didn't speak. He just listened, his pale eyes unblinking. When I finished, he asked only one question, his voice a dry, papery whisper. Do you have access to his business accounts? His partnership agreements? K-1s? Tax returns from the last 7 years? I'm his wife, I said. I have access to everything. It's all on our home server. Voss finally showed a sliver of emotion. He gave a thin, reptilian smile. Good! That will make this much easier. He stood up, clutching his satchel. I'll need a drive with copies of everything. Every statement, every email, every tax return. Give me 1 week. If he's moving marital assets, he's left a digital footprint. I'll find it. He looked at me, his pale eyes seeing right through my competent facade. Diana's right, Mrs. Reed. He can't know. He can't suspect an audit. You have to be normal. I will, I said. He nodded. They always get sloppy, he whispered, more to himself than to me, as he slipped out of the room. The new life is always expensive. I walked out of that high-rise into the blinding Texas sun, my burner phone in my pocket, and a $100,000, charge pending on my private credit card, felt lighter. I had handed the blueprints for my revenge to the 2 best contractors in the state. That night, when Mark came home from a work dinner, smelling of sandalwood and Chloe's floral perfume, I was waiting for him. Hey, I said, smiling, handing him a glass of wine. How was your day? Long, he said, sighing, taking the glass. You're the best. Go take a shower. You look exhausted, I said, my voice full of wifely care. As soon as I heard the hiss of the water in our master bath, I was in my office, my face illuminated by the glow of the monitor. I plugged in a high-capacity external drive. I logged into our server, and with a steady hand, I began to copy everything. The next 10 days were a masterclass in domestic theater. I was the star, the director, and the stage manager of a play called The Perfect Progressive Marriage. I hosted a dinner party for 2 of his partners at the firm. I smiled at them, my voice warm as I offered them a second glass of the '09 Barolo. I laughed at their jokes. I was the picture of the supportive, successful wife. Chloe's name was never mentioned. I wondered if they knew, if they were all in on this grand, humiliating joke. I watched them eat the food I'd prepared in the house I'd designed, and I felt nothing but a cold, clean patience. Mark was blissful. He was a man who had successfully hacked the universe. He had his rock and his revitalization too. That was amazing, Lee, he said after the partners left, helping me stack the plates. He was a little drunk, his eyes soft. You were amazing. They love you. They're good people, Mark, I said, my voice smooth. It's good to stay connected to your work. He smiled, oblivious, and I felt a twinge of something almost like pity. It was the pity a biologist might feel for a specimen in a jar just before the formaldehyde. He thought he was the visionary, the one in control. He had no idea he was already a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. All the while, I waited. I was an architect waiting for a soil report. I couldn't finalize the demolition plans until I knew exactly what was underneath the foundation. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't my iPhone. It was the burner, the cheap plastic slab I kept hidden in my drafting desk, buried under a roll of blueprints. It vibrated, a low, angry bzz, bzz against the wood. It was an unknown number. A text Voss, 11 a.m., 8700 Research BLVD, Suite 112I, checked the address. It wasn't Diana's high-rise. It was a low-slung, anonymous office park 20 minutes away, the kind of beige stucco box that housed dentists and insurance agents. It was perfect. I went to the kitchen, where Mark was making a smoothie, the blender screaming. "I've got to run out," I yelled over the noise. Site inspection for the library. The steel fabricator sent over the wrong gauge I-beams. It was a plausible, boring lie. "What?" he called back, hitting the off button. The silence rushed in. "Steel fabricators," I repeated, grabbing my keys. "They're idiots. I have to go fix it. I'll be back this afternoon." "Okay, you're the best." Love you," I said. The words were just sounds, like a door closing. The office in Suite 112 smelled of stale coffee and dust. The fluorescent lights hung, casting a sick greenish glow. The only furniture was a metal desk and 3 chairs. Arthur Voss was waiting for me, his pale, rumpled suit blending into the beige walls. He looked like he'd been sleeping there. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't offer me coffee. He gestured to the desk. It was covered in spreadsheets, printouts, bank statements. And in the center, a thick, spiral-bound report, like a college thesis. "You were correct," Voss said, pushing his glasses up his nose. "Your husband isn't just careless. He's a criminal." My heart didn't pound. It didn't ache. It just stopped. I waited. "His infidelity spending was easy," he said, tapping one spreadsheet. "The hotel, the dinners at the Velvet Quill, the flowers, a significant purchase from a jewelry store in the Domain. He didn't need to tell me I hadn't received any jewelry. That's just noise. That's the 50-50 you wanted to avoid." He slid that sheet away, revealing another. "This is the problem." He pointed to a line item. GSD&M Partners Distribution. It was Mark's quarterly bonus, deposited not into our joint checking, but into our joint brokerage account. The one I never looked at, the one I had funded with my inheritance to get us started 20 years ago. 6 months ago, Voss whispered, tracing a line with his pale finger. "Your husband started moving money. Significant money. He's been using a forged digital signature, yours, to authorize wire transfers." I felt the blood leave my face. "He's stealing. He's embezzling," Voss corrected, his voice holding the first trace of professional satisfaction. "From you, from the marital estate, he'd transfer the funds, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, to an umbrella LLC he controls. He thought he was being clever, hiding it as investment capital." Voss slid another document across the desk. "It was an LLC incorporation filing from the Texas Secretary of State. But he is careless," Voss said. "He got sloppy. The LLC wasn't the final destination. He was using it as a pass-through, a washer. He produced a final set of bank statements, this time for the Shell LLC. I saw the transfers in from our brokerage. And then I saw the transfers out, dozens of them, week after week. They were all going to one place. A new LLC, one I'd never seen before. What is C strategy?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Voss gave me his thin, reptilian smile. He handed me the C Strategy Incorporation papers. "It's a lifestyle brand, Mrs. Reed, a startup." I read the name on the filing. "The sole managing partner, Chloe Stevens." I had to sit down. My legs went weak. The cheap office chair creaked under my weight. He wasn't just dating her. He wasn't just leaving me for her. He was using my money, the money from my family, the money I had earned designing buildings that would outlive us all, to build her a new life. He was stealing my past to fund their future, the open relationship, the revitalization. It was all a game, a distraction. He'd kept me busy analyzing the ethics of his exploration while he was in the vault, drilling open the safe. This wasn't a betrayal. This was a heist. "How much?" I asked. The words came out flat and dead. Voss tapped his calculator, a final, definitive click. "As of this morning, $432,000. And change." He pushed the thick-bound report toward me. "It's all in there. The forged signatures, the wire transfer receipts, the LLC filings, copies of emails from his work server to her, discussing the seed money and their brand launch. He'd gotten into the firm's server. It's wire fraud." It's felony theft. And, he added, adjusting his cuffs, since he didn't declare any of this as income or gift, it's also a significant case of tax evasion. I looked at the report. It was thick. It was heavy. It was a bomb. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I stood up. My legs were steady now. The ice was back, thicker than before. The anger was so cold, so pure, it was almost serene. I finally had the complete set of blueprints. I saw the entire rotten structure, from the cracked foundation to the stolen fixtures. And now I knew exactly where to plant the charges. "Thank you, Mr. Voss," I said, my voice clear and strong. I picked up the report. "This is comprehensive. Please send your invoice to Ms. Kincaid." "It's already been sent," he rasped. I tucked the report into my oversized architect's satchel. It fit perfectly. I drove home, going exactly the speed limit. The report sat on the passenger seat, a silent, heavy passenger. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a wife. I was an executioner, and I had just been handed the warrant. I got home an hour before Mark. I walked into my office. I unlocked the bottom drawer of my flat file, a drawer he didn't even know had a key. I placed the report inside. I locked it. I went to the kitchen, pulled a chicken from the fridge, and began to prep it for dinner. I was humming. I knew it was coming. For a week, I had walked around my house, my city, my life, with the Voss report locked in my flat file. It was a physical weight, a dense 200-page block of pure distilled truth. And carrying it, knowing what I knew, had made me preternaturally calm. I was no longer an architect navigating a problem. I was an architect who had signed the demolition order and was simply waiting for the permits to clear. He picked a Tuesday. Of course he did. It was our sacred night, the one rule he'd been so careful to observe ever since I'd discovered his lies about the other sacred nights. He was giving me the respect of a scheduled execution. He'd been different all day, jittery. He'd made himself 3 cups of coffee before 9 a.m., but hadn't drunk any of them. He kept sighing, running his hands through his hair, a man practicing his sad regret. "Let's just eat in tonight," he said via text. "I'll pick up that salad you like from Josephine's. We need to talk. We need to talk." The same 4 words he'd used to propose the open relationship. The words that had started it all. He was so predictable, such a creature of habit and cheap theater. "Sounds lovely," I typed back. At 7 p.m., we were at the 10-foot dining table, the same place where he'd pitched me ethical non-monogamy. The house was silent, just as it had been then. He pushed wilted arugula around his plate. I ate. I was actually hungry. "Lila," he started, putting his fork down. The clink on the ceramic plate was sharp. I looked up, my face a mask of neutral inquiry. He couldn't meet my eyes. He was studying his napkin. This was the performance. This is... He let out a long, heavy sigh. He was acting. "God, this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do." I waited. I said nothing. "You're my rock, Lee. You always have been. You're the most amazing woman I've ever known." He was laying it on thick, buttering me up for the kill. "And you've been so incredible through this. So progressive. So understanding." "I've tried," I said, my voice a model of gentle sincerity. That gave him the opening. He finally looked up, his eyes full of practiced, agonizing sincerity. "That's just it. You've been so good about this. You gave me this freedom, to explore. And I never expected this to happen, Lee. I swear I didn't." He paused, waiting for me to prompt him. "I didn't. I just watched. I've fallen in love, Lila," he said, the words a quiet rush. "Oh?" I said, allowing just a tiny, perfect tremor in my voice. "With Chloe." He said her name. He'd never said her name to me before. It hung in the air between us, a physical, ugly thing. It happened, he said, talking faster now, the confession spilling out. "It was an accident. It was just supposed to be what we agreed on. But she's special, and I can't live this way anymore. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to her." He was painting himself as the tragic, noble hero, caught between two incredible women. The audacity of it was almost admirable. I just stared. I let the silence stretch, fill the room. I let him sit in it. He mistook my silence for shock, for pain. He saw the victim he'd been counting on. He reached across the table and, with a horrible, familiar gesture, placed his hand on top of mine. I didn't pull away. I just let his skin, warm and damp, rest on my cold hand. "Lee," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, intimate whisper, "I want a divorce." There it was. "I don't want to hurt you," he continued, squeezing my hand. "That's the last thing in the world I want. I want us to do this the right way, the progressive way, like we've done everything else." I felt my pulse, a slow, steady, cold beat. "Thump, thump, thump," I was thinking, he said, the salesman now moving in for the close. "We can do a conscious uncoupling. No lawyers, no mess. We're better than that. We're not animals. What does that look like, Mark?" I asked. My voice was a whisper. He visibly brightened. I had engaged. The negotiation was beginning. "It's simple," he said, pulling his hand back. "All business now. We sell the house. It's a great market. We'll make a killing. And we split everything, right down the middle. 50-50, all the accounts, the brokerage, everything. Clean, amicable." He smiled. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. He was offering me 50% of what was left. 50% of the estate he had already plundered. He was offering to amicably split the house I had designed, the house he wanted to sell to fund the lifestyle brand of the 31-year-old he'd been funding with my money. He thought I was the rock. He thought I was the fool. He thought in this exact moment that he had won. He had his new life. He had his young, ambitious girlfriend, and he had just conned his old-fashioned wife into giving him half of what remained, believing it was a fair, progressive, and generous deal. He looked at me with an expression of such profound, patronizing pity. It was breathtaking. He was waiting for the tears, for the yelling, for the breakdown. I was perfectly still. The architect in me was admiring the sheer, fraudulent structure of his arrogance. It was a marvel. I looked at him, the man I had lived with for 20 years, the father of... No, thank God, we never had children. The man who had shared my bed, the man who was, at his core, a common cowardly thief. I took a sip of my water. The glass was cold. I met his gaze, and I let a small, tight, precise smile touch my lips. "Thank you, Mark," I said, my voice as calm and clear as the glass in my hand. "Thank you for being so honest." The look on his face. It wasn't confusion, not yet. It was relief. He thought my smile was acceptance. He thought I was, to the very end, his perfect, progressive, understanding wife. He had no idea. He had no idea I had the blueprints to his prison, and he had just handed me the key. He was still smiling that smile of patronizing pity. He thought he had won. He thought I was sad, broken, and defeated. He was waiting for the tears, for the, "How could you?" He had no idea. I let him have that one last perfect second of ignorant bliss. I let him believe he was the master of this universe, the brilliant salesman who had just closed the deal of his life. I smiled back. "No, Mark," I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the architectural silence of the room, sharp as a shard of glass. "We won't be doing that." His smile faltered. "Just a flicker." "What?" "Lee, be reasonable." "I am," I said. "I'm being methodical." I reached down to the briefcase by my chair. The one he'd assumed was full of library blueprints. I pulled out a thick, spiral-bound document and placed it on the table between us. The thud of it hitting the marble was the sound of a judge's gavel. It was the Voss report. I slid it across the polished table. It glided, perfectly smooth, and stopped right next to his plate of wilted arugula. He stared at it. "What is this?" "Your own proposal?" "Lila, this isn't a business deal." "That," I said, "is where you're wrong. It's always been a business deal. You just forgot to tell me. That is the structural folder. It's a full forensic accounting report, Mark. compiled by a man named Arthur Voss. His hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, froze. The blood began to drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, papery gray. "He's a bloodhound," I continued, my voice calm and conversational. "He found everything." Mark opened the cover, his movement suddenly clumsy. He saw the spreadsheets, the bank logos, the photocopies of wire transfers. He saw on page 3 a high-resolution scan of my forged signature. Next to his own, "It details," I said, as if reciting a list of building materials, "the $432,000 you embezzled from our joint brokerage account. It details the Shell LLC you created to launder it, and it details the final destination of that money, C Strategy, LLC, Chloe Stevens' little startup. My money, Mark. The inheritance my father left me. You used it to fund your girlfriend's lifestyle brand." He made a sound. A small, choking gasp. "It also," I added, "contains the full timeline. The photos from your laptop, the texts, the affair that started last May. 6 months before your progressive proposition." He slammed the report shut. "Lila, You don't understand. I was going to pay it back." "No." I cut him off. Cold. Final. "You're a thief, Mark, and a coward. But mostly you're just sloppy." I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a second, thinner document. A single sheaf of papers, held by a clip. I slid it across the table. It came to rest on top of the Voss report. "This," I said, "is a post-nuptial agreement, drawn up by Diana Kincaid. You have 2 options." I leaned forward. I had his full, terrified attention. "Option 1, you sign that document. Tonight, you cede this house, your pension, and all shared liquid assets to me. You will walk out of here with your personal effects, your laptop, and the car you drove here in. It will be an amicable, no-fault divorce. We will consciously uncouple." His face contorted, a mask of rage and disbelief. "You're insane. I'll fight you. 50-50, that's the law." "Which brings us to option 2, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. "You fight me. And the moment you do, that," I tapped the thick bound report, "gets delivered to the SEC, the IRS, and the managing partners at your firm. You haven't just committed infidelity, Mark. You've committed wire fraud, tax evasion, felony theft." I let the words hang in our perfect silent room. "You won't just be divorced. You'll be disbarred. You'll be audited into ruin. You will be prosecuted. You will go to prison. And Chloe, she'll be right there with you, implicated as a co-conspirator for receiving stolen funds." He stared at me. The charismatic salesman was gone. The revitalized man was gone. All that was left was a pale, sweating, 50-year-old man, completely and totally trapped. The cool, progressive wife, the rock he thought he could stand on, had just pulled the ground out from under his entire world. He looked at the report. He looked at the post-nup. He looked at me. And for the first time in 20 years, he finally, truly saw me. He slumped, the fight draining out of him, leaving a hollow, defeated shell. You cold-hearted bitch," he whispered. "I'm the architect, Mark," I said, pushing my pen across the table. "You just never bothered to read the blueprints." His hand, shaking with a rage he couldn't unleash, picked up the pen. He uncapped it. He signed his name on the last page. He had just demolished his own life. A few days later, I watched from the glass wall of my living room as he loaded 2 cardboard boxes and a garment bag into the back of a scratched, 10-year-old Honda Civic. Chloe was in the driver's seat. Her face was pale, all her sharp, ambitious angles looking pinched and bitter. She didn't get out of the car. Their new beige stucco rental apartment complex was halfway to San Antonio. Their startup was dead. The seed money was frozen, clawed back by Diana's office. Their passion, I imagined, wouldn't survive the first month of his financial ruin and her profound disappointment. 6 months later, I stood in the middle of that same vast, empty room. The polished concrete floors, scrubbed clean, echoed my footsteps. The house was sold. I didn't stay. I had designed the house as a home, but he had turned it into his prison. I was just the one who controlled the demolition. I didn't need it anymore. I stood at the Austin Bergstrom International Airport, my reflection staring back at me from the bright departures board. Rome, Lisbon, Florence. He thought I was afraid of being old-fashioned. He thought I was terrified of being abandoned. He never realized that after 20 years of being his rock, of supporting his hollow structure, what I really wanted was just to build something new. For myself, I picked up my single black carry-on bag. My one-way ticket was in my pocket. I turned, my face not smiling, not sad, just at peace. I walked toward the gate, and I did not look back.